I'm Lily, 30 years old. I want to tell you about a past that I kept hidden for many years because it was too painful and hard to accept. There are things in life that we never thought would happen to us, but they still come and change everything. I never imagined that I would have to live in torment because of a truth that, until now, I still find it hard to accept. My story is not a story about love or family happiness, as people often think, but about trade-offs and hidden emotions. People say that love is the only reason for two people to get married. But in the case of my mother and stepfather, I knew that was not true. From the first time he appeared, I felt something was wrong. And gradually, I realized that my mother was just an excuse. I was the reason he married my mother. My mother, Yelisa, was the owner of a small fashion shop. After my father passed away when I was young, my mother raised me and took care of me until I was an adult. With her resilience and determination, my mother not only took care of our lives but also developed her fashion store into a place that many people love. My mother has always been a model of strength and independence in my eyes. Life went on in a steady and peaceful manner. My mother continued to work hard at the fashion store while I focused on my studies. As time passed, I entered a transitional phase of my life when I entered university. It was the first time I felt like I had truly escaped my mother's protective embrace and stepped out into the wider world. The early days of university brought me many new things, and then one day I met Mr. Matthew, who was not only my teacher but also my stepfather. Mr. Matthew was a philosophy lecturer, and from the very first day of class, I was fascinated by the way he taught. He not only helped me gain a deeper understanding of the subject, but also changed the way I looked at life. Our after-class conversations became more frequent, and through that I realized that he was a person who had a great influence on me. However, gradually, I began to feel something strange in his eyes when he looked at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as time went on, this feeling became clearer and clearer. There were moments when I was talking. He looked at me not just like a teacher to a student, but with a deeper gaze, as if there was something he was not saying. That gaze contained an intimacy, a silence full of hidden meanings, and I began to feel uncomfortable. Every time that gaze appeared, I felt a little confused. It was not the gaze I was used to, but a gaze that seemed to be examining me, as if expecting something from me that I could not understand. I wondered if I was imagining too much, but this strangeness could not be denied. That feeling became more and more obvious, and I could not ignore it anymore. As time passed, not only Mr. Matthew's eyes, but I also began to notice strange actions from him. Every time I talked or simply walked by, he would try to stand closer to me, sometimes placing his hand on my shoulder in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. Those gestures seemed harmless at first, but to me they became heavy, making me feel uneasy. Once, he kept me after class to discuss the lecture, but that conversation was not like the previous times. He did not just talk about the subject, but seemed to want to prolong the meaningless meeting. That unnecessary gaze and intimacy made me feel confused and suffocated. I no longer felt the respect and distance that should exist between teachers and students. Gradually, I didn't dare to see him as much as before. I made up all sorts of excuses to avoid private conversations after school. When he offered to help, I could only refuse with the excuse of being busy, but in my heart I just wanted to keep my distance. I tried to sit further away in class, limited eye contact, and sometimes even intentionally went to school late to avoid having to see him before class. I thought that if I avoided seeing Mr. Matthew, everything would be fine. If I didn't have to face those strange looks and actions, then maybe I would forget the anxiety that was surging inside me. For the rest of the school year, I tried to avoid seeing him again. Everything seemed to return to normal when I kept my distance, and I was assured that all the trouble was over. However, I didn't expect that the safety I created for myself was only temporary. After a year of school, when I returned home, I noticed that something was different about my mother. She was more cheerful than usual, her eyes lit up whenever she talked, and sometimes she would laugh quietly to herself, as if hiding a special happiness. I began to wonder, but my mother just said that she was very happy because life was getting better. Then one afternoon, when both mother and son were sitting in the living room, my mother suddenly sat down next to me, her face radiant, her eyes shining with an unconcealed joy. She began to share something important, that she had met someone special, someone she wanted to introduce to me. Seeing the happiness evident in her every gesture, my heart was also happy. For so many years, my mother had raised me alone, giving up her own joys to devote all her energy to taking care of me. I felt relieved that she had finally found the joy and happiness she deserved. The day my mother prepared to introduce that man to me, I was very much looking forward to it. The house was neatly arranged that day. The dining table was carefully set by my mother, and I could see the excitement and joy in her eyes. I also hoped that this man would bring my mother the comfort and happiness she had been searching for all this time. When the doorbell rang, I felt my heart flutter. Mom quickly went to open the door, while I stood waiting in the living room, imagining the man who would come into her life. When the door opened, and I saw that the man who entered was Mr. Matthew, my heart was filled with an indescribable shock. I stood still, unable to believe my eyes. All the uneasiness I had felt about him suddenly came rushing back, surrounding me. The man my mother loved, the man she had introduced me to with such trust and happiness, was the man I had been trying to avoid all this time. A series of conflicting thoughts exploded in my head. Why him? When did they know each other? Did he have any intentions? The uneasiness in my heart rose strongly. All the memories of his strange looks and unpleasant gestures came flooding back, making it impossible for me to think clearly. All the worries I had tried to ignore were now clearer than ever. I looked at my mother, trying to find a sign that she recognized the strangeness of the situation, but she was completely oblivious. She was still smiling, happily introducing Matthew as if everything was fine. In my heart, this was simply a debut of a man she loved, not knowing that Matthew's presence was causing a storm in my heart. Mr. Matthew walked in, still smiling calmly, looking friendly and polite. He greeted me, then pretended to be surprised, saying that he didn't expect me to be my mother's daughter. I tried to act surprised too, but inside I was in turmoil. My mother, innocent and unaware of what was going on in my head, laughed and was happy to discover that Matthew was my teacher. The two of them happily chatted, discussing this unexpected coincidence, while I just stood there, a feeling of insecurity clinging to me. I couldn't stop asking myself, who was Mr. Matthew really? And why did he appear in my mother's life, in a completely different role than what I knew him to be? Was this really a coincidence, or was there something hidden that I couldn't see? From that day on, everything went on as usual. There were no strange signs from Matthew or anything that made me worry. Mom and Matthew grew closer and closer. Their feelings were very natural. I saw Mom happier than ever. She smiled a lot and looked radiant every day. Not long after, Mom decided to remarry, and Matthew officially became my stepfather. Everything went smoothly, nothing unusual happened, and our family life continued, peaceful and stable. As time passed and there were no strange signs, I began to feel that I was thinking too much. Perhaps the initial worries were just due to the stress of facing the changes in Mom's life and my own. Seeing Mom happier every day, I gradually let go of my doubts and insecurities. Seeing my mother smiling brightly with Matthew, I realized that the most important thing was that she had found the happiness she deserved. Finally, I accepted their relationship and gave them my blessing from the bottom of my heart. I hoped that my mother would continue to live in that joy, and I also learned to accept Matthew as a part of our family. As time passed, I did not see any unusual signs in Matthew as I had worried. Gradually, I blamed myself for thinking too much, letting unfounded worries affect me. Seeing my mother increasingly happy with Matthew, I also felt relieved. Finally, I felt happy for my mother and sincerely wished her well, hoping that her life would always be filled with joy and happiness. At that time, I thought that everything would just go on peacefully. It had been a long time without any unusual signs from Matthew, and I gradually felt reassured. I no longer worried or doubted my stepfather, because he had always been a good person, caring for my mother and family. I truly believed that my previous concerns were just my sensitivity and imagination. When I was 22, I had graduated from university and started looking for my first job. Although I had not found a suitable job, I decided to help my mother at her fashion store. We spent more time together, and Matthew often stopped by the store, helping with small tasks when he had free time. Everything was still going smoothly, and I no longer had any doubts about Matthew. I truly believed that he was a good husband to my mother, and had also become a part of my life. But then, on the worst day of my life, everything changed. I was sick that day. The fever made my body tired, not enough to go to the store with my mother like every day. My mother told me to stay home and rest, and I didn't think much of it. Only Matthew, my stepfather, was home with me that day because he didn't have to go out. At first, I didn't worry or suspect anything. After all those years of living together, I believed that he was a good, trustworthy person and loved my mother very much. I lay in my room, trying to lull myself to sleep to forget the pain and fatigue caused by the fever. However, that peace didn't last long. The thing I never expected to happen happened that very day, in the house that I once considered the safest place. Matthew came into the room with a glass of water and some pills. He said they were painkillers to help my fever go down faster. His voice was gentle and kind, nothing that made me suspicious. The fever had made my head spin, and I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get over it and get some sleep, so I took the pills from him and took them without hesitation. I drank the water and swallowed the pills, not knowing that this was just the beginning of the worst that was about to happen. At that moment, everything seemed normal, and I didn't notice anything unusual. After I finished drinking, I didn't feel anything unusual. The medicine didn't seem to take effect immediately, and I was still fully aware of my surroundings. I lay there quietly, thinking that the fever would soon subside. However, after about 20 minutes, things began to change. Matthew returned to the room, this time without medicine or water. There was something in his eyes that worried me, but when I tried to sit up, I was shocked to find that my body could no longer move. A feeling of paralysis spread throughout my body, as if all my strength had been sucked out. I panicked inside, trying to brace myself to escape this helplessness, but there was nothing I could do but lie there, eyes wide open as Matthew walked closer. Matthew walked closer, his face calm, but his eyes flashed with something that sent a chill down my spine. I struggled, tried to move, but my body seemed completely paralyzed. Not a single finger could move. The helplessness frightened me, but that fear increased even more when Matthew leaned down, his face just a little away from mine, and he smiled. His smile was no longer friendly and gentle like before, but there was something scary and cold. Then he whispered, his voice soft but clear enough for me to hear. "I have waited for this opportunity for a long time." I was horrified, not believing what I had just heard. My mind was spinning, trying to understand what was happening, but everything seemed to fall apart at that moment. The worries and doubts from before suddenly became too real, and I realized that the nightmare I had thought was just an imagination had become reality. Matthew sat down next to me, his eyes full of calculation and his smile sinister. I still lay there helpless, unable to move or resist, only able to listen to his every word. Each sentence echoed clearly, gradually revealing a horrifying truth that I had never thought of. He began to explain that ever since I entered college, he had feelings for me and had always wanted to get close to me. He had tried every opportunity to get closer to me, but he noticed that I always kept my distance and did not let him get close. His attempts to approach me failed, and it was my avoidance that made him choose another path to get deeper into my life. Matthew began to learn about me, delving into my personal information and background at school. When he learned about my mother and my family situation, he decided that the only way to get close to me was through her. He planned to get to know my mother, gradually gaining her trust. Everything seemed to happen easily to him, and before I knew it, he had become my mother's husband, becoming a part of my family life. Hearing those explanations, I felt like I was falling into a deep pit of despair. I could not believe that everything that happened around me was so meticulously arranged. What I had thought was normal, was my mother's happiness, now turned out to be just a play, with the ultimate goal of getting close to me. I felt the utmost pain and disgust when I realized that, from the beginning to the end, everything was part of his plan. After he finished speaking, Matthew began to move closer, his eyes filled with satisfaction as he saw me lying motionless on the bed. I was completely helpless as Matthew approached. His eyes no longer had any of the gentleness that my mother had seen. They were greedy and cold. I tried to shrink back, but I couldn't. Every movement seemed hopeless. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body felt like it was locked, no longer obeying my will. And then Matthew leaned down, his hands sliding over me, bringing with them a feeling of disgust that I couldn't shake. He took control, took my body, without mercy. I could only lie there, paralyzed, feeling every moment he took me. The seconds stretched like an eternity, and all I could do was hope for it to end. But no, he didn't stop. The world around me seemed to collapse. All the peace I had now was torn away by him. I wanted to struggle, to fight back, but it was all in vain. Matthew didn't stop, and my body no longer belonged to me. Time seemed to drag on forever, each passing second becoming a nightmare with no way out. I lay there, helpless, staring at the ceiling, trying to escape reality, but everything kept happening, slowly, painfully. The feeling of paralysis, of losing control, made the fear in me rise with each second, each minute. Every move he made, every touch, was like a blow to my self-esteem and dignity, pieces of me shattered without any way to stop it. I felt my body no longer belonged to me. I was completely taken over by him. Everything happened so slowly, I could only lie there, living in terror, with no way to fight back. Each moment lasted for hours, and I just wanted it all to end. When it was over, I lay there, feeling empty and numb. The room seemed cold, stifling, and lifeless. Matthew stood up, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened, while I lay still, unable to escape the horror I had just experienced. I felt my entire world collapse. Everything I knew and believed in now faded and meaningless. My mind was filled with echoing questions, full of pain and anger. I could not understand why it had happened. How could the person my mother loved, the person I had tried to accept as part of my family, do this to me? The pain, fear, and betrayal all mixed together, suffocating me, leaving me with nothing but helplessness and despair. Matthew glanced at me one last time, his eyes cold and remorseless, then left the room, leaving me with all the hurt, the torment, and the growing obsession in my mind. I didn't know how to face this reality, didn't know how to continue living, when everything seemed to have completely collapsed. After a while, as the effects of the drug gradually wore off, I felt control slowly returning to my body. Still weak and dizzy, I tried to stand up. Every movement was painful, but I knew what I had to do next. My hands were shaking as I tried to straighten my clothes, trying to hide the traces of the horror I had just experienced. I looked around the room, my eyes stopping at the phone on the table. It was my only way to call for help, to end this nightmare. With weak steps, I approached, my hands still shaking as I picked up the phone. I dialed 911, each number becoming more difficult. When the operator's voice came through, I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice from cracking, and let it all out. The police arrived in a matter of seconds, but to me the wait seemed like an eternity. When they entered the house, the silence was broken. Voices rang out, footsteps hurried, and finally Matthew was arrested. He didn't resist, just bowed his head silently as the police handcuffed him, as if he knew it was over. My mother returned shortly after the police arrested Matthew. She saw me, still shaking and weak, standing next to the police. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. I looked into my mother's eyes, and all my strength seemed to disappear in that moment. I couldn't hold it back any longer, tears streaming down my face as I told her everything. My voice broke as I told the truth about Matthew, about what he had done, and about all the horror I had been through. My mother was stunned, her eyes wide with confusion and pain. She didn't say anything the whole time I told her, just stood there, as if her whole world had collapsed. When the story ended, my mother collapsed, sobbing in utter grief and regret. She blamed herself for not realizing what was wrong, for bringing someone like Matthew into our lives. In her pain, she only repeated one sentence over and over again: "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I knew that no apology could ever erase the pain we were feeling." That day, everything changed forever. My mother could never forgive herself, and I could never go back to the way my life was before. After the police arrested Matthew, a part of me felt relieved, but the pain and hurt did not go away immediately. I had gotten justice for myself, had bravely faced what he had done, but that did not mean the haunting would go away. My mother, after hearing the whole truth, sank into a deep state of remorse and regret. She could not stop blaming herself for letting Matthew into our lives and not realizing his true nature. She decided to leave the house we shared and close the fashion store for a while to find peace of mind. Matthew was convicted, and I knew I would never see him again. But that was not enough to erase the wounds in my heart. He had ruined a part of my life, and no matter how much time passed, the pain remained, like a scar that would never heal. From these horrific events, I learned that silence is never the answer to pain or fear. Courageously facing the truth, no matter how painful it is the only way to find peace of mind. Silence and concealment will only prolong the pain and eat away at you. I also realized that, even though my mother did not know what had happened, the trust she had placed in Matthew and in me had led to unpredictable consequences. Talking and sharing feelings and thoughts with loved ones is extremely important. If I had had the courage to speak up when I sensed something was wrong with Matthew, perhaps things would not have come to this. Although Matthew was punished and my mother realized her mistake, our lives have not returned to normal. I have to learn to live with the pain, with the hauntings of the past, and find peace from wounds that are difficult to heal. As for my mother, she also has to learn to forgive herself. Everything is still going on, and I cannot be sure what will happen in the future. But one thing I know for sure: I will not be silent anymore. I will continue to move forward, no matter how difficult the road is. The regret and pain will still follow me, but I know that I have begun my journey of healing. And although the road is long and difficult, I will no longer be a victim of silence. I will find myself again and find the strength that I lost in that nightmare.